Don't you hate going first? Doesn't it feel unfair to fall behind in the energy race? What if I told you there's a deck in this game that actually wants to go first, but's better when it goes first? Welcome to Arceus Lightning Ramp. Our main goal with this deck is to get Arceus online as fast as possible with Zero Aura, Elemental Switch, and Pichu. By our second turn, we can be doing 130 damage. We can even occasionally snipe 50 or 60 HP basics before they can evolve. Okay, let's look at the cards, starting with Arceus, the star of the show. 140 HP, pretty respectable, with an ability that does sometimes come in handy, mostly preventing poison in this metagame. And its attack for 3 colorless energy does 70 damage plus 20 damage per each Pokemon you have on your bench. So that's 90, 110, and then 130. Of course, that's also related to why we have 7 Pokemon in this deck and they're all basics, so no matter what Pokemon we draw, we can put it on the bench and it can power up Arceus' attack. Now, the attack scaling like this is nice in some circumstances, but it's a little bit of a double-edged sword. One of the nice things is, obviously, it does scale up to be a lot of damage for only 3 energy, and it's nice to be able to catch your opponents off guard with leaving only maybe 1 Pokemon on your bench and then filling it up and suddenly attacking for 130 when they weren't sure how much you were going to attack for the turn before. But, of course, this means a good percentage of the time you're actually not going to be attacking for your full 130 damage because either you just didn't draw the basics that you needed, or you had to send a basic out to tank to make sure you don't lose the game, and that means losing that basic actually reduces your attack by 20 damage. So sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. 2 retreat cost, which is not the cheapest in the game, but usually it's not that big of a deal because Arceus is what we want in our active slot. And push comes to shove, we do have a leaf to back up this retreat cost. And a weakness to fighting, which in this metagame isn't that big of a deal, but it can sometimes get you in trouble. And next, let's look at Zero Aura. Another basic, of course, 90 HP, does 50 damage for 2 energies, which on the face of it isn't exactly a great attack, but everything comes together when we look at the ability. The ability always gives us an energy on Zero Aura at the end of our first turn. Of course, if it's not your first turn, then this ability does absolutely nothing, which is one of the weaknesses of this Pokemon, but the trade-off is we can actually make use of this energy. Our number one goal, of course, is to get it onto Arceus with Elemental Switch. And again, that fighting weakness. It's definitely not ideal that all of our Pokemon except for Pichu have the same weakness in this deck, but it's not that bad either. Next, Oricorio, 70 HP, and of course an ability that prevents it from taking any damage from EX Pokemon. And it seems like EX Pokemon are getting more and more prevalent as the metagame develops, so this card is becoming more and more important. Of course, some decks are also adapting, throwing in non-EX Pokemon to deal with Oricorio, but Oricorio is still important. The last Pokemon is Pichu. It's seemingly unassuming at only 30 HP, but its attack is very good. No energy cost, that's what this little circle means, but a lightning energy on one of your bench Pokemon. What this means is, on your first turn, before you generate any energies, you can actually put an energy on one of your bench Pokemon. Ideal world, of course, this is Arceus. And Pichu also has no retreat cost and no weakness. Lack of a retreat cost is really what brings this deck together, which allows you to switch in Arceus on your second turn without spending any energy on the retreat. Let's move down to our trainers. First, we have Pokeball and Oak. Just like most decks in this game, we run 2 of each. In this deck, usually Pokeballs are a great draw because it means we can power up our Arceus, and of course Oak is good in every deck. It's also good to keep in mind that sequencing Oak and Pokeballs correctly in this deck is very important, especially if you don't have enough basics to attack with your max damage on Arceus. If you use Oak first, and then you use your Pokeballs, you have a higher chance of hitting basics with Oak. This is because Pokeballs take basics out of your deck. Leaf is situationally very good. Sometimes we have to retreat Arceus and we don't want to burn energies, and sometimes we just have an Oricorio or a Zero Aura out in our active spot, and we want to retreat them while still retaining their energies to use Elemental Switch. Serena and Cyrus don't particularly shine in this deck, but they are just good utility cards. Next we have Giovanni and Red, our 2 cards that increase our damage output. If we have our max damage Arceus attack on the board, Giovanni is good for bringing our attack up to 140 damage, which takes out a lot of Pokemon in the meta right now. For example, Espeon, Sylveon, Buzzwole, Darkrai, or even other Arceuses. And of course Red does the same thing, but increases our damage output to 150. This will let us take out Pokemon like Giratina, Flareon EX, Ho-Oh, and Lugia. Giant Cape will keep us protected in the mirror match, and it's good against the most popular deck in the meta right now, Darkrai Giratina. If a Darkrai Giratina deck puts 1 energy on Darkrai, it does 20 damage to us, and then if Giratina attacks, it does a total of 150 damage. Cape keeps us at 160 HP, just out of range of getting killed in 1 turn by Darkrai and Giratina. And Elemental Switch is perhaps the coolest card in this deck. It really keeps this deck interesting. Obviously, our A plan is to take the energy that we generate at the end of our first turn with Zero Aura and move it to Arceus on our second turn to be attacking, but there are also situations where you have more creative options, like moving an energy from your bench to your Zeraora or your Oricorio with a Giovanni to snipe an enemy basic Pokemon even if they have 60 HP when they aren't expecting it. Okay, now let's talk about our basic game plans. Like I said before, our plan A is to get Arceus on the board as fast as possible and do the most damage. And the best way to do this is when you go first. If you put Pichu in your active slot, and then Zeraora and Arceus on your bench, you can attack with Pichu on your first turn. That generates 1 energy, you put that on Arceus. Then at the end of your turn, your Zeraora also generates an energy. Then your opponent goes and passes it back to you. On your second turn, you can retreat Pichu for free since it has no retreat cost, put Arceus in the active slot, move the energy from Zeraora to Arceus with your elemental switch, and then take your energy for the turn and also put it on Arceus, and then you're doing at least 110 by your second turn. Hopefully you also have another basic in your hand that you can put in your last empty bench slot, which will do 130 damage on your second turn with Arceus. Now, of course, this doesn't always come together every single game, going first, having Zeraora, Arceus, and Pichu, but there are other ways that we can do as much damage almost as fast. For example, if we go second, we only need Arceus, Zeraora, and Elemental Switch. First, we put Arceus in the active slot and Zeraora on our bench. Then we take our energy for our turn and put it on Arceus. We end the turn, and that generates an energy on Zeraora. Our opponent goes and then passes back to us. Then, of course, we take our energy for the turn, put it on Arceus, and use Elemental Switch to take the energy that Zeraora generated at the end of our last turn and put it onto Arceus. This means that by turn 4, you can have Arceus online and attacking. The alternate version of this is if you have Pichu and Arceus. Your opponent goes first, and then you take turn 2. You put Pichu in an active slot and Arceus on the bench. Then you take your energy for the turn, and you put it on Arceus, and attack with Pichu. You take the energy that Pichu generates with its attack and put it on Arceus. And then your opponent goes and passes back to you. So it's turn 4, your second turn. You retreat Pichu, because it has no retreat cost. Arceus has 2 energies, you take your energy for the turn, put it on Arceus, and then you attack. Of course, ideally, you also have other Pokemon to put on your bench from your hand at this point. Now, one of these options is pretty likely to happen every game, but sometimes things don't go according to plan and we have to switch to plan B. If you go first and you only get Zeraora, you can put Zeraora in your active slot, and it generates an energy at the end of your first turn still. It's almost like you generated an energy for your turn. Then, on your second turn, you can be attacking with Zeraora for 50 damage. Sometimes it's nice to also throw a Giovanni on top of this to snipe a basic, because your opponent has only had 1 turn so far. And those are our 2 main game plans, but let's go over some alternate scenarios that sometimes crop up. For example, sometimes you can suss out that your opponent is probably playing a deck that's mostly going to rely on EX cards. In these scenarios, if you start out with Oricorio and Zeraora, you can put Oricorio out to start with, then Zeraora on your bench. This means that by your second turn, you'll be attacking for 50 damage with your Oricorio if you can get the Elemental Switch. And like I mentioned before, one thing to keep in mind with this deck is sometimes you actually want to sandbag some Pokemon in your hand. Imagine if your opponent is staring down just an Arceus and a Zeraora, and they're not sure how many Pokemon you have in your hand, so it's hard for them to plan around how much damage you're actually going to do next turn. Of course, saving Pokemon does open you up to red card, and that moves us perfectly into the weaknesses of this deck. First of all, red card and silver are kind of our worst nightmare. Because it's nice to sandbag Pokemon, it can be really bad if we're sandbagging Pokemon and then we get red carded and our Pokemon disappear, which means our Arceus attack is suddenly much weaker. And of course, sometimes Elemental Switch is also nice to sandbag because you don't want them to know how quickly you can attack them. It also hurts if this gets taken away by red card. And especially in this meta, we're pretty reliant on Giovanni and Red to make sure that we can kill enemy EX Pokemon in one hit, which means Silver taking one of these cards away is a pretty big setback. This deck is also a little bit soft to fighting decks. Thankfully, there aren't that many fighting decks that are in Tier 1 right now, but you do occasionally see Rampardos and Donphan. Depending on the situations, these can be pretty hard matchups, especially against Rampardos, because you can't one-shot it with Giovanni or Red. And even if it attacks you and kills itself with the trade, you still only got 1 point while they got 2. Another weakness is Pichu or Oricorio only openings. Sometimes you just don't draw anything, your Pichu dies, and you lose the game. And honestly, even Arceus only draws can be a little bit rough. Thankfully, you still do have something to do if you can get up to 3 energies, but it certainly doesn't feel unfair like some of the game plans this deck has up its sleeve. And speaking of, this deck's best draws really do kind of require getting the right cards in the right order. Which, to be fair, there are a lot of variations of the right draw for this deck, which means it's not too fussy, but sometimes it just doesn't come together. But overall, this deck is great, and it's gotten me a lot of ladder points, so maybe you guys should try it out and tell me what you think.